What if one man's carefully crafted image of wealth and influence concealed a story that would shake the foundations of power across the world? Tonight, we take you inside the rise and fall of Jeffrey Epstein, a financier who moved effortlessly through elite circles, built relationships with some of the most influential figures of our time, and left behind questions that still demand answers. How did he accumulate such extraordinary access, and why did scrutiny come so late? In the next few minutes, we break down the facts, the controversies, and the lasting impact of a case that continues to challenge the very systems meant to uphold justice. Power rarely announces its arrival with thunder. Sometimes it moves quietly through private meetings, exclusive dinners, and whispered introductions that shape the course of history long before the public ever notices. This is where the story begins, in the shadows of ambition and influence, where a man with modest and largely unverified academic credentials would steadily construct an image of wealth, brilliance, and access that opened doors most people never even see. Jeffrey Epstein, once an obscure figure with a background that raised as many questions as it answered, would eventually become a name spoken across newsrooms, courtrooms, and living rooms around the world. His rise was not marked by a single dramatic breakthrough, but by a series of calculated steps that positioned him alongside financiers, academics, royalty, and political leaders. In the competitive landscape of Wall Street during the late 20th century, reputation was currency, and Epstein seemed to understand how to cultivate it with remarkable precision. He presented himself as a financial strategist capable of managing vast fortunes for the ultra-wealthy, claiming expertise in navigating complex markets and tax structures. Though public records of his early qualifications remain limited, he demonstrated an uncanny ability to gain the trust of powerful individuals who value discretion above all else. As he transitioned from teaching mathematics at a prestigious preparatory school to working in the financial sector, questions about how he made that leap were often overshadowed by the confidence he projected and the endorsements he appeared to receive from influential backers. In elite circles, perception can become reality, and Epstein's carefully maintained persona as a mysterious but highly capable financier gave him entry into spaces where fortunes were protected and influence was exchanged. Over time, he acquired properties in some of the most exclusive locations in the United States and abroad, hosting gatherings that blended business, philanthropy, and social prestige. Photographs from those years reveal a man comfortable among celebrities, scholars, and statesmen, reinforcing the narrative that he had secured a legitimate and powerful place within the global elite. Yet even as his profile expanded, details about the precise mechanisms behind his extraordinary wealth remained difficult to pin down. Publicly available information described him as a private money manager serving a select group of billionaires. But the scale of his assets, including luxurious estates and private aircraft, fueled speculation about how such financial success had been achieved in relative secrecy. Supporters portrayed him as a brilliant strategist who preferred privacy, while critics quietly wonder how someone so discreet could wield such visible influence. The world of high finance often rewards those who operate behind closed doors, and Epstein appeared to thrive in that environment, cultivating relationships that further strengthened his standing. He aligned himself with philanthropic initiatives, funded scientific research, and engaged with institutions that valued substantial donations, actions that reinforce an image of legitimacy and generosity. Universities and cultural organizations welcomed his contributions, and his presence at exclusive events suggested that he was not merely accepted but embraced by some of society's most respected institutions. As his network widened, so did his aura of untouchability, an impression that would later become central to understanding how he maintained his position for so long. Observers noted that influence, once accumulated, tends to protect itself, creating layers of insulation around those at the center of power. Epstein's story illustrates how strategic alliances can blur the line between scrutiny and silence, especially when financial resources and social capital converge. By the early 2000s, he had firmly embedded himself within influential circles, presenting a narrative of success that few publicly challenged. For many, he symbolized the enigmatic financier whose wealth afforded him extraordinary access, a man who navigated elite environments with confidence and apparent ease. Yet beneath the polished exterior, there were already murmurs of concern that would later erupt into global headlines. At this stage, however, those whispers were largely confined to limited spheres, overshadowed by the magnitude of his connections and the complexity of the networks he had built. The rise of Jeffrey Epstein serves as a compelling case study in how reputation, association, and strategic positioning can elevate an individual from obscurity to prominence within systems that often resist transparency. It also invites deeper reflection on how modern power structures function and how individuals who master their language and expectations can ascend rapidly despite unanswered questions. In examining these early chapters, we begin to see not only the architecture of one man's ascent, but also the broader environment that enabled it, an environment where wealth commands attention, where exclusivity shields inquiry, and where influence, once secured, can reshape the narrative surrounding those who hold it. As the years progressed and his name became more frequently associated with extraordinary privilege, a subtle tension began to form beneath the polished surface of his public image, hinting that the story of Jeffrey Epstein was far more complex than the narrative of a discreet financier serving billionaires. In environments where influence and wealth intersect, scrutiny often moves slowly, but it never disappears entirely, and by the mid-2000s, questions that had once circulated quietly began to gain momentum. Allegations emerged that cast a dark shadow over the carefully curated persona he had constructed, challenging the assumption that proximity to power guaranteed integrity. What followed was a legal process that many observers later described as unusually lenient, resulting in a controversial plea agreement that allowed him to avoid federal prosecution and serve a limited sentence under conditions that critics argued were far from severe. The outcome raised profound concerns about whether justice operates differently when the accused possesses extensive resources and influential connections. For some, the case seemed to confirm long-standing fears that systems of authority can be shaped, delayed, or softened by those with access to legal expertise and political networks. Despite the gravity of the allegations, Epstein managed to maintain relationships with prominent figures, continuing to move within elite circles even after his conviction. This period intensified public suspicion, as the contrast between the seriousness of the accusations and the relative lightness of the consequences appeared stark. Investigative journalists began to re-examine the details surrounding his finances, his associations, and the mechanisms that had enabled him to sustain both wealth and status in the face of mounting controversy. The media spotlight grew brighter, revealing inconsistencies and raising new questions about how accountability had seemingly been deferred. Suspense deepened as each report uncovered additional layers, suggesting that the original understanding of his activities had been incomplete. Observers wondered how many institutions had overlooked warning signs and whether reputational concerns had discouraged more aggressive inquiry. The broader public, increasingly aware of systemic inequalities, viewed the unfolding developments through a lens shaped by skepticism toward concentrated power. When renewed federal charges were announced years later, the sense of inevitability was mixed with disbelief that it had taken so long for the case to resurface with greater intensity. His arrest sent shockwaves through financial, political, and social networks, signaling that the insulation once provided by influence might be eroding. Court documents and investigative findings reignited global attention, prompting widespread debate about the structures that allow certain individuals to operate with minimal oversight. Then, in a sudden and deeply unsettling turn, news broke of his death while in federal custody, an event officially ruled a suicide, but one that immediately generated widespread doubt and speculation. The circumstances surrounding his death, including reported lapses in jail supervision and malfunctioning surveillance cameras, fueled suspicion and conspiracy theories that continue to circulate. The abrupt conclusion of the criminal proceedings left many questions unanswered, intensifying the public's demand for transparency. For victims seeking justice and for citizens concerned about institutional integrity, the unresolved aspect of his case became symbolic of larger systemic failures. Suspense reached its peak not because of what was known, but because of what remained uncertain. The absence of a full trial meant that potentially significant testimony and evidence would never be presented in open court, leaving a void that speculation quickly filled. Lawmakers called for investigations into both the handling of his prior plea agreement and the security failures that preceded his death, while journalists continued to examine the web of associations that had defined his life. The unfolding narrative underscored the fragile balance between influence and accountability, demonstrating how quickly reputations can collapse once scrutiny intensifies. It also highlighted the critical role of investigative reporting in challenging entrenched power structures, reminding audiences that persistent inquiry can bring hidden realities into the public domain. In the aftermath, Institutions that had once accepted his donations or welcomed his presence faced their own reputational reckonings, reevaluating policies and strengthening oversight mechanisms. The story of Jeffrey Epstein thus evolved from a tale of extraordinary access to a cautionary account of how concentrated wealth and social capital can distort accountability processes. It forced a global audience to confront uncomfortable questions about privilege, justice, and the responsibilities of those who operate within elite networks. As the legal chapters closed without a definitive courtroom resolution, the broader implications continued to unfold, shaping conversations about reform, transparency, and the protection of vulnerable individuals. The suspense that once surrounded his rise now lingered around the unanswered questions of his fall, leaving behind a legacy defined not only by controversy, but also by an urgent call to examine the systems that allowed such a trajectory to occur in the first place. In the wake of his death, the story did not fade into silence, but instead expanded into a broader examination of the structures that had shaped and shielded him, compelling societies across the globe confront difficult truths about influence, accountability, and the responsibilities of institutions entrusted with public confidence. The name Jeffrey Epstein became more than a reference to one individual. It evolved into a symbol of how complex networks of wealth, reputation, and authority can intertwine in ways that obscure transparency for years. Investigations continued into his financial dealings, his professional associations, and the systems that had enabled him to maintain credibility long after serious allegations had surfaced. Civil lawsuits filed by victims moved forward, bringing testimony and documentation into the public record and ensuring that the conversation would not be defined solely by unanswered criminal proceedings. Each legal filing and court decision reinforced the principle that accountability can extend beyond a single courtroom, especially when public awareness remains engaged. Institutions that had once accepted donations or collaborated on initiatives face renewed scrutiny, prompting policy reviews and, in some cases, public acknowledgments that safeguards have been insufficient. Universities strengthened vetting procedures for donors, nonprofit organizations reassessed governance structures, and corporations revisited compliance frameworks, all in recognition that reputation must be supported by rigorous oversight rather than assumption. Legislators proposed reforms aimed at addressing weaknesses in plea bargaining practices and improving transparency within the justice system, reflecting a growing demand for equal application of the law regardless of wealth or status. The broader cultural impact was equally significant as journalists, activists, and citizens debated how deference to power can silence warning signs and delay intervention. Documentary series, investigative books, and long-form reports sought to reconstruct the timeline of events, offering detailed analysis of missed opportunities and systemic blind spots. While opinions varied regarding specific aspects of the case, there was widespread agreement that sustained investigative journalism played a crucial role in bringing hidden dynamics into view. News organizations emphasized the importance of verifying facts, protecting sources, and resisting external pressure, reaffirming their commitment to responsible reporting in an era when misinformation can spread rapidly. The unresolved elements surrounding his death continue to fuel speculation, yet official inquiries and internal reviews underscore the necessity of evidence-based conclusions rather than conjecture. For many observers, the enduring lesson was not found solely in the dramatic rise or sudden fall of a single figure, but in the collective reflection that followed. Communities began to ask how gatekeepers of influence can better identify risks, how victims can be supported without fear of retaliation, and how transparency can be embedded into systems that have historically prioritized discretion. Educational institutions incorporated discussions of ethics and power into curricula, encouraging future leaders to recognize the moral responsibilities that accompany professional success. Advocacy groups strengthened networks to assist survivors of abuse, ensuring that their voices would remain central to ongoing reform efforts. The narrative that once centered on exclusivity and privilege gradually shifted toward resilience and reform, highlighting the capacity of public engagement to drive institutional change. As court cases progressed and settlements were reached, financial resources were directed toward compensation funds, signaling a tangible acknowledgement of harm. Though no legal outcome could erase past suffering, these developments demonstrated that persistent pursuit of justice can yield meaningful, if imperfect, results. International attention also spurred cooperation between agencies in different countries, reflecting the global dimension of financial and social networks that transcend borders. The case became a reference point in policy discussions about regulatory oversight, nonprofit governance, and corrections management, illustrating how a single scandal can catalyze wide-ranging evaluation. Ultimately, the story serves as a reminder that power without accountability carries profound risks, and that vigilance is a shared responsibility across professions and communities. Transparency is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing commitment that requires courage from whistleblowers, diligence from journalists, integrity from officials, and awareness from the public. As we continue to examine complex global events, this narrative underscores the necessity of questioning assumptions and demanding clarity even when confronting influential figures. The legacy of Jeffrey Epstein is inseparable from the broader dialogue it sparked about justice, oversight, and ethical leadership. By learning from these events and insisting on consistent standards, societies can strengthen the safeguards that protect the vulnerable and preserve trust in public institutions. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.